Why Warhol at the Ashmolean?
Well, Warhol, I think now, and actually with every passing year, he becomes more important as an artist. And so the Ashmolean collection obviously spans from millennia BC to today. And I think it's important for the museum that, as well as concentrating on our great historic collections, we also bring the modern and contemporary into the museum. The exhibition was put together in a rather different way because it's about these works, all of them, belong to one man, rather extraordinarily, who went to Oxford. In fact, he was at Keble, and then became a commodities broker, amassed a huge fortune and an even huger art collection. And so these are Andy Warhols, and so actually the selection was made, if you like, by the collector.
Amazing. So it's quite important to have people who, I don't know, decide to collect such amazing art because then they can share it with the general public.
Yes, no, absolutely. I mean, I have to say that before the show sort of opened and before it arrived on the walls, I was slightly anxious about what this rather random cross-section through Andy Warhol's career would actually look like on the walls. But actually, I think it's rather thrilling because there are lots of things that aren't there, which doesn't sound like a very good sort of marketing speak for the exhibition, but there isn't a Marilyn, there isn't an Elvis, there's the ghost of a soup can. So many of the most familiar Warhol works aren't there. But of course Warhol is so familiar that it's actually rather helpful not to have them there, because what's interesting about the collection, I think, is quite what a varied picture of Warhol emerges through the exhibition. And so we have some of the iconic works of Billet Box and flower pieces, but there are also lots of far less familiar works, including an amazing, I think, last room of these black and white works, all produced in the last year of his life, and which are part of Warhol's that people really don't know.
Yeah, so it's a great introduction to possibly the Warhol that people aren't really familiar with and doesn't really spring to mind when they think of him.
Yes, I mean, I think you couldn't walk through the exhibition and not realise you were in an Andy Warhol show. So, of course, he's riffing on many of the same themes all the time. There are some, a wonderful wall of his great portraits from the 70s and 80s, which are quintessential Warhol. But again, some of those are rather unusual in the way they're made, and almost none of them have been seen in public before. So, I mean, the other excitement of having, if you like, a private collection on our walls is we are showing things that people haven't seen before.
On walking through the museum, you are confronted with all these works from way back in human civilization, and here we have Warhol's works, which are fairly contemporary. Do you think that he's an accurate representation of contemporary society's outlooks? Or?
Yes, I think one of the things that emerges in the show is that he was a great portrait maker of not only individuals but actually precisely of society. I mean, so the Great Wall of Portraits, there's this famous desire of Warhol's that in the 70s and 80s he started making these portraits to a standard format, 40 inches by 40 inches, all made in the same way, based on Polaroids that he took. And he had this idea that one version of each of these portraits should all be brought together and hung as a single work of art in the Metropolitan in New York, as a portrait of society. And so in that way he's rather like a number of historic artists, I mean Reynolds being one, who sort of painted the celebrity culture of the 18th century. I mean, Warhol's absolutely doing the same thing with this sort of international celebrity circuit of the late 20th century.
Well, he was clearly ahead of his time because, I mean, it's not the same thing, but if you just think of all the photo sharing apps we have today, such as Instagram, I mean, it's that same format of several different images together creating some sort of gallery. And whilst selfie culture is slightly different, but I guess if Warhol's around today, he'd have a lot to say.
I am sure he would be Instagramming away. I mean, one of the things that, again, comes through the exhibition is quite how influential Warhol has been on what has come since. And so we've got this wonderful room of his films. So these were made in the early 60s, sort of experimental films from which comes almost all later video art. I mean, and it's, I mean, of course there were others experimenting in similar ways, but what Warhol did with, there's a great Empire State film, 8 hours of a single shot of the Empire State Building, but then there are also these wonderful screen tests, these film portraits of various, again, sort of celebrities and hangers-on in the studio. So there's Bob Dylan and Edie Sedgwick and others, sort of slightly awkwardly sitting in front of this still camera, not quite knowing what to do with themselves. But they're wonderful things, but so influential on how artists have behaved since. And the idea that the artist, the artist's hand is not important, that mechanical reproduction, that film, that video can all be part of what an artist does. Much of that comes from Warhol as well.
Do you have a personal favourite in the collection?
In the Warhol, or
in the Warhol collection?
Well, there is a wall of drawings which which I really didn't know before. They're not well-known parts of what he does, and in reproduction they look fantastically dull, and sort of, they're clearly sort of tracings of I think projections that he sort of traced around. But actually in the flesh you can see just what a brilliant draftsman he was. I mean, just how confident he was with the pencil, and obviously he started life as a commercial illustrator, and so he really could do it. He kept sort of, if you like, denying himself the opportunity to do it, to sort of limit the amount that his hand is involved. But those drawings sort of reveal it despite himself, I think.
Well, you've just mentioned the importance of maybe seeing a work of art up close as opposed to seeing a reproduction. How important is it that art galleries and museums remain free and open?
Well, open, fantastically
yes,
important.
Well.
Free, I think, I mean, there is this great tradition in this country of free entry to museums, which I do think changes the way that museums are treated by the people who come to them. And most importantly, of course, is the local population and families. And if you go to the Louvre or the museums of Europe, yes, there are lots of people in them, but the people who aren't there are the locals. And the great thing about a free museum is that you can pop in and see one thing or two things and pop out, and actually that's often the best way to experience what they have. And there's nothing worse than being stuck in the Louvre all day, having paid however much you've paid, wandering the corridors exhausted. And if you go there, you can see that everyone has this sort of slightly panicked, dazed look in their eyes. And a free museum means that that doesn't have to happen. And so I really hope we can all hang on to that idea. It's clearly under a certain amount of threat at the moment because of public funding, but it's certainly something that I want to hold on to. Having said that, of course, we do need to charge for exhibitions, but I'm very happy to say that Oxford University students, because we are the Oxford University Museum, can come to the Warhol for free, so that's great.
Well, I'm quite glad you mentioned popping into a museum or a gallery and looking at one piece of work or something, because I very much thought that the way I consumed art and things like that was a bit wrong, because my favourite museum back at home is the Tate Modern, because it's near where I live, and I used to sort of just pop in and think, oh, I'm going to wander around the gallery today, and I thought, maybe I'm doing art a bit wrong, maybe I'm not.
I think the thing about art is you can't do it, you really cannot do it wrong. I mean, there's no right or wrong way, and of course people, if you like, consume it in all kinds of different ways, and of course, as you say, many people are consuming it on their iPhone these days. But I do have to say that coming and seeing the real thing, and the Warhol is a very good case in point, and the point is made as you walk from the exhibition into the shop, where of course all those familiar reproductions of Warhols are available at very reasonable prices. But the difference between those sort of glossy photo prints and the actual things is substantial, and that's the other, if you like, surprise of the exhibition.
What is the Ashmolean Museum doing to involve the local community and other people who might not normally visit museums and galleries? What's it doing to include them?
Well, it's doing a lot of things. I mean, one of them is to put on exhibitions like Warhol, which are bringing new people into the museum. I mean, so that's one way of doing it, but of course it's not the only way. So over half term, the place was humming with activities for families and children that we put on. But then there are, of course, those people who would never think of coming to a museum, and encouraging them into the museum is a much more time-consuming, expensive, but I still think worthwhile job. And so for that we often rely on external funders like the lottery, and the Heritage Lottery Fund have funded a series of sort of outreach programs around the Manet painting that was bought a few years ago by the Ashmolean. And so we've been working with young carers, with troubled teenagers, with dementia sufferers, around to sort of bring them into the museum and show them what they can get from sort of looking at the works here and thinking about them and responding to them.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for speaking to us today.
Not at all. Pleasure.